Welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Edmonds. I have been working with Passivhaus Trust over the last year in the social housing campaign. This event today is all about the case for Passivhaus, and it is in a series of events that have come out as a result of a big event that we held in January, all about Passivhaus Social Housing. Once we had that event, we realized that there was quite a lot of information available through all of our speakers and partners in Passivhaus, but also on the Passivhaus Trust website. But we had done a lot of engagement, and we had understood where some of the pain points were for local authorities and social housing providers on some key areas in delivering Passivhaus projects. So this is one, the business case for Passivhaus. We did have one on contractors and procurement and access to contractors back in March, and we will have one on costs in September. We'll come to that later. We'll share some links about what else is coming up with Passivhaus Trust. But yes, so if we can move on to the next slide, although maybe I have access to do that. There we go. So that's the context from me, really. We have got 3 excellent speakers for you today. This is the running order of the day. We're going to hear from each speaker and then do a little bit of focused Q&A with each of them. So as I said, drop your questions in the Q&A for each of those. Once we've heard from our final speaker, we will then invite all speakers back for a full panel Q&A. And then we'll close once I've shared a couple of extra slides. Don't worry about what comes up on screen. You'll get any slides that are shared. You'll get links and things in what we call our party bag at the end of the event. So that'll land in your inbox with the email address that you signed up to attend this with. So just sit back and relax and enjoy and listen to these incredible speakers. So first up, we are going to have Emma Davies. Emma is from the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service. And Emma, I'm just going to give you the mic and let you introduce yourself more. And I'm looking forward to chatting to you in about 10 minutes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. Lynn, if you wouldn't mind sharing my slide for me, I will apologise in advance. We're having appalling IT issues at the moment. So I'm hoping I don't disappear or anything partway through what I'm going to talk about. But yeah, I'm Emma. I work for the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service. I'm a Principal Sustainability Officer. So my role is primarily to provide technical advice on planning applications related to sustainable construction. And I also develop planning policy related to climate change, net zero carbon, climate adaptation, all sorts of areas. Also work on kind of some of our corporate projects as well, provide a bit of advice on corporate projects. And what I'm here really to share with you today is some of the work that our housing development agency for Cambridge, which is it's a joint venture between the City Council and Hill. And they've been building new affordable housing now for a few years. And a few years ago, they actually took a decision to build to the Passivhaus standard and to certify to Passivhaus. So I thought I would just give you a bit of an overview, really, of the work that was done to help inform that decision. So back in 2021, which doesn't seem that long ago, but I think it probably really is, we actually commissioned Bureau Happold to carry out some life cycle costing, basically looking at 4 options for us, which are shown on this slide, related to kind of operational energy standards and looking to kind of transition even towards net zero carbon development. So as I say, we looked at 4 options which are shown on this slide. So we had a kind of our base case option was effectively complying with our existing local plan. So that's very much kind of, it's a percentage improvement over Part L 2013, which is the old Code for Sustainable Homes Level 4 requirements. So that was a kind of gas fueled approach, fairly standard approach to energy efficiency, and some photovoltaic panels on the roof of properties for a bit of energy generation. We then had a local plan plus option, which is actually the new Part L 2021 pretty much. standard. So a little bit of kind of fabric improvements, heat pumps, photovoltaic panels, and some hot water storage with wastewater heat recovery. We then had the option of Passivhaus certification. So that's kind of why we're all here today. So fairly obvious, very ultra high levels of energy efficiency, electric heating and hot water, solar technologies, and again, looking at kind of wastewater heat recovery. And then the final option was kind of almost like it was Passivhaus certification plus a little bit more. So effectively looking at trying to deliver net zero carbon on site. So that also then included looking at the idea of battery storage, so that you could store some of the energy actually generated on site. And the study considered capital cost uplift, which is shown on this slide. It looked at typical annual maintenance costs. And actually, really importantly, I think particularly for, when you're thinking about social housing and the role of local authorities, it looked at annual energy costs for our tenants. And I think that's a really important bit of information to consider, particularly in the current economic climate. So summary of the results are shown on this slide. I do have to say, I think for me, the capital cost uplift for Passivhaus, it seems a little bit high to me. Bureau Happel did look at a lot of the kind of cost reports that have been published by the Passivhaus Trust. But what they did note is that, that initial uplifting cost would come down over time, as was experienced at Exeter, for example, as kind of, teams get used to designing and constructing to the Passivhaus standards. So that cost would kind of come down over time. So in taking the decision to adopt Passivhaus, the council took a number of different factors into consideration. So key really was our declaration of a climate emergency. And I think what the slide shows you in terms of the kind of the energy demand and carbon reduction that you can get from Passivhaus, that was a really important factor for us. And also we've got commitments as an authority around reducing fuel poverty amongst our residents. And we know that from others who have built to the Passivhaus standard that actually if you can reduce fuel costs from residents and reduce that fuel poverty, you can also help reduce rent arrears, for example, as well as benefiting the health and well-being of your residents. So that was a really significant factor for us in actually taking that decision to build to the Passivhaus standard, because it is quite a significant reduction in annual energy costs that you will get from Passivhaus certification. And I think the other thing that we took into account was the kind of maintenance side of things. And thinking about, with Passivhaus, it is an inherently low carbon system. It's low energy design. So you're actually then able to use slightly simpler heating and hot water systems, which helps to reduce complexity for residents and our maintenance teams as well. So that was another really important factor for us in taking that decision. So yeah, I think, I just thought it would be useful to share this kind of summary slide with you to show, everything that we took into account and the importance of working with kind of cost consultants who've got a really good grasp of the Passivhaus standards. So I think for us, that life cycle costing approach, rather than just thinking about upfront capital cost, was a really important consideration for us. And I think just a final thought from me as well, as I mentioned earlier, I provide technical advice on planning applications. We are in the process in Greater Cambridge of developing a new local plan. As part of that, we are looking at introducing net zero carbon building standards and using metrics which are very, very similar to those included in Passivhaus. And I think for me, as someone who feeds into that kind of planning process and provides that technical advice, being presented with a proposal that is seeking to achieve Passivhaus certification tends to make my life a lot easier, because I know about the level of rigor that kind of sits behind the certification process and how that means that the kind of targets and the metrics and the quality of build associated with Passivhaus are actually going to be delivered once schemes are actually constructed. So I think for me, it's really, really useful to have schemes coming forward now that are using the kind of passive house certification approach. We do also get some schemes coming forward that are following passive house principles, but I think it's that level of rigor with the certification process that kind of almost makes me breathe a kind of slight sigh of relief in that, you know, I know that we're not necessarily going to have a performance gap here, and that this, you know, this system is going to actually work. So that's really important. And I think it's also a standard that members sitting on our planning committees really, really value as well, both in terms of the passive house standard, and I know we're here to focus on new build today, but also actually the NFIT standard for retrofit. Sustainable construction is only one consideration in determining a planning application, but it does help to provide that certainty about delivery and that what's being proposed is actually realistic. And in some cases where we've had retrofit schemes using the NFIT standard, that's actually led to planning committee approving applications that planning officers were recommending for refusal. So, you know, don't underestimate the potential benefits of the kind of the passive house approach and standard in actually sometimes helping to put forward a kind of positive approach for applications due to that level of kind of ambition and that level of rigor surrounding the standard. So I think that's probably it from me in terms of kind of presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
I had lost my unmute button there. We were having all sorts of tech interesting things. Emma, thank you. Thanks so much. I know there was a few people saying that they couldn't really read the slide because of the quality of it. We did discuss that. Emma has had a nightmare tech day where their whole systems went down. So this was the best backup that we had for it. But we will
apologies.
Try and find, or at least when you have the source slide, folks, in your email, you'll be able to open that up and have a look at it a little bit more and dig into that content a bit more. So I think we do have some questions. And I'm going to start with one in the chat, but I also have some myself. So the question is from Una, and it says, what is the status of Passive House in the Greater Cambridge Local Development Framework at the moment? And is it intended to be included in the local plan in some way?
So our current local plan, which we developed at the time of the Housing Standards Review, joy. So we have wording in the supporting text of our policy that encourages the use of certification schemes such as Passive House. We had a bit of an argument with one objector at our examination who thought that we were trying to require Passive House, and we were like, no, we're just encouraging it. We're not requiring it, but we're saying we support its use. It's a slightly tricky situation with local plans and local planning authorities in that we're not allowed by national policy to set specific construction standards for new homes. But what we're looking to do with our emerging local plan, which is kind of it's at kind of preferred option sort of stage, is that we are saying, well, actually, you know, we've got a huge amount of growth in our area. And we think it is viable to set specific metrics related to net zero carbon operational emissions. And if you're familiar with the work of Letty, because we did actually work with Etude on these metrics, our emerging local plan has a series of metrics to achieve net zero carbon operational emissions. So it sets a space heating demand for all new homes and non-residential. We have an energy use intensity figure. And then we have an energy balance figure, which is about generating enough renewable energy on site to meet the annual demand associated with that kind of energy use intensity figure. So it's very, very similar numbers to those that are included in Passive House. I think off the top of my head, and I've got slight brain fog at the moment. I think our space heating demand is around between 15 to 20 kilowatt hours. Our energy use intensity for homes, I think that's around, I want to say 35.
Okay.
So yeah, off the top of my head. So I hope that helps to answer that question a little.
I think it does, and I also think it covers off another question that was also in from Una, in fact, probably before that one, which was which definition of net zero carbon did Bureau Happold use for this study? So I'm presuming it's as you've just described, and using what was in the Letty.
Yeah, we were actually working on the early version of the policy at the same time that Bureau Happold were doing the work for the Housing Development Agency. So we kind of shared our metrics, and I seem to recall we even had a meeting between Bureau Happold and Etude as well to discuss some of the work that they were doing to underpin the metrics that we were looking at including.
I think this is really interesting because what you're describing, as much as we're talking about the specifics of the business case for and the metrics that you're setting, there's another issue here which I think is really useful for us all collectively. You know, there's 185 people here in the room at the moment, probably from a broad range of organizations and institutions. And I just think it's worth noting the huge surge of cross-industry, including public sector collaboration that's happening, and the sort of collective upskilling and knowledge building that is happening, which I find really, I suppose, optimistic. And I think there is this really I see this really goodwill from industry and local authority, where this is great, just fundamental desire to share that knowledge and to check in with okay, we're doing this work, but also what else is happening out here, so we can leverage that good quality information to help accelerate success with some of this and sort of with the uptake. So I have a question. I'm just going to jump in, host prerogative, on specifics of what goes on within your sort of departments and with your colleagues within Cambridge, and how much pressure you're under to deliver certain targets within your climate declarations, but also, and the action plans, but also, we all understand that resources are tight and pressure is high, and not least the economic conditions, not only for procuring buildings, but also for residents. So are you seeing that sort of upskilling? Is there provision? Is there support for the upskilling of your colleagues as well to sort of help with the dissemination of that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, we've got real political support both in Cambridge and in South Cambridgeshire. South Cambridgeshire has got a housing development agency as well now, and they are looking at Passivhaus. I don't think they're as close to certifying, but they're certainly looking at Passivhaus principles. So there's really strong kind of political support for us to be going further and to be as ambitious as we can be. Definitely it is a learning curve. I've learned a lot about net zero, and then it's, there's also the embodied carbon piece, which is a whole other area that I'm learning a lot about. But yeah, I think there is a lot of desire to try and upskill not just the sustainability officers within the team. There's the people working within the HDA and everything that they're learning as they're going. And I think, they have, in some cases, in some of the developments we've been working on, they haven't always gone for certification, but they've been testing certain things. So there's a certain degree of learning on the job. And we are working with people, with architects who have delivered Passivhaus before. So I think that's really important, to be learning from those people who already know and have got a track record in delivering. We're always also looking at how delivery of some of these things relates to kind of wider planning considerations. So we've been doing quite a lot of work recently on how you integrate sustainability into design codes. So that involves, colleagues in urban design, even landscape architects. We're all kind of learning about, this isn't just a kind of technical approach. It has an implication for how you design schemes as well. So how you can reflect that in design codes and kind of neighborhood codes and those sorts of things. So Yeah, we could always do with more skills, I'm not going to lie. But there's definitely a willingness there to learn and, kind of view almost each project as a kind of learning process, and then apply that to your next scheme. And
which is arguably why the measuring of success is so vital as well. Because if we commit to better standards and more robust processes, then we need to be able to not only prove by the existence of something that does have no performance or a less performance gap, I suppose, but also having the data to back that up, which in itself then becomes part of the case for doing, taking these more robust approaches.
Yeah, and on that, I would say as well, one of the things we're talking about as well is when it comes to, assuming we can adopt our emerging local plan policy, we then need to think about how you implement that and what sort of form we want calculations in. And we're learning from there's a number of local planning authorities who have now successfully adopted these sorts of policies and who are saying, you need to use PHPP so that we know that the information you're submitting is robust. Trying to kind of convert stuff into SAP, for example, it's not perfect at all. So there's lots of discussions going on, and kind of local authorities kind of, we're sharing with one another, right? What's Cornwall and Bath and North East Somerset and Central Lincolnshire, who've all adopted these policy requirements, how are they finding the implementation and the sort of information that needs to be submitted? We're also looking at post-occupancy evaluation requirements linked to our new local plan policy as well. So all about making sure that what's being proposed can actually then be delivered in practice.
Yeah, we do. We need that data. I'm going to ask one more question. We have got lots in the Q&A box, but I'm also just really interested in listening to what you're saying, flowing. But because it's had a couple of upvotes, I'm not sure. Well, there's a few that have had upvotes, so that's great. These are, we may or may not be able to answer these exactly because of, it depends on your familiarity with the slide. Maybe I'll take this one. Annual maintenance for zero carbon jumps to 1.9 thousand per annum. Why is this higher than the PH standard of 1,000 pounds per annum? Is that something that you can answer?
I can try. Yeah.
Okay.
I do know from talking to colleagues in the Housing Development Agency, they were questioning those maintenance figures a little bit, and it was something that they were going to keep an eye on over time. My understanding with the kind of net zero carbon approach is the maintenance goes up because the complexity of systems slightly increases.
Okay.
And I think that is primarily down to the battery storage aspects. So I think it's linked to the fact that you're getting slightly more complex systems.
Yeah, which I suppose is connected back to that whole bit around the education and the upskilling and understanding what we're putting in, and when we're putting in pieces of kit, let's say, that the user interface with those things is for residents as well as for building maintenance people is as straightforward as it can be, because I think whilst we're still unfamiliar with some of that, there's a bit of risk pricing that goes into those sorts of things as well, where people just aren't as familiar, hence the need to measure. Okay, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say we're familiar with some of the systems, so we are starting to do things like installing air source heat pumps now. But yeah, battery storage, to my knowledge, I don't think we have got that on any of our schemes yet, but it's soon to come, I think.
I'll ask one more because I think it's really particularly relevant here, and then we're going to move on. It doesn't mean we won't come back to those other questions in the Q&A. We'll do our best to get through some of those in the wider Q&A session at the end. But this one is from Charles, and it says, when building to Passivhaus standard, how does the financial viability stand up, given social or affordable rent levels that you can charge? I guess that's the question between, the capital cost and protecting rent levels. dare I wade in and say, I think it's really difficult because this is probably a case-by-case situation.
I think so. I mean, I don't think it's resulted in us increasing rents. Although I do remember, this was years ago now, but I remember another event on Passive House, and it might have even been at a Passive House conference that Emma Osmondson, previously of Exeter, I think she was saying that they were finding, because they were getting residents out of fuel poverty and reducing rent arrears, I'm sure I remember someone saying that they were actually able to slightly raise their rents. But as far as I know, I don't think we've looked to do that in Cambridge yet. But yeah, there's probably kind of case by case basis involved in that. It's not an area that I tend to get directly involved with. Anything financial, I try and kind of
well, it's just as well that we're going to have a cost-focused session on the 28th of September that everybody can come along to there, where we'll get stuck into some of the financial complexities to sort of help with navigating some of that space. But Emma, thanks a million. Your brevity in your presentation allowed us a more in-depth Q&A session there, but I will hopefully you'll still be with us and your system won't collapse for the whole table Q&A. But thank you very much for that. And we're going to move on to our second speaker. So can we please welcome Eleanor Warwick from the Clarion Housing Group. Eleanor, I'm again passing the mic straight over to you. You can introduce yourself and take it away. Thank you so much.
Let me do the screen share.
Right.
Okay. Let's get that up there. Can everybody see that perfectly? Good. Hello, I'm Eleanor Warwick. I work in the strategy and policy team at Clarion Housing Group, and Clarion's really large. We've got 125,000 properties, which is home to 1/3 individuals. Some of these homes are over 125 years old. So we're a big landlord with the responsibility to maintain and upgrade. We've got a very large delivery pipeline of new homes, mainly affordable rent or social rent, but because of housing associations cross subsidy models, some of them are for shared ownership and or market, even sort of like market sale. And I'm sure so many people here on the call will be familiar that are low-income housing residents, they're a much more vulnerable cohort than the general population. They tend to be older, have disabilities, are living in overcrowded homes, and are at real risk of fuel poverty. So today, even though that last slide had some very big numbers on it, Clarion's number of passive houses is schemes is a single one. So that's why I actually sort of said it's about making the argument. I'm well fitted to talk about making the argument for the case of passive house, and that it actually covers a huge range of issues: retrofit, new build, the desirability of passive house immediately to new occupants, but actually also as a long-term asset for the housing association. And you can sort of see all these points that I've got here. I'm not going to run through them now, but they are points I'm going to mention in the next sort of like few sort of like slides. And I think there's some of the brain dumps of some of the issues that Emma's already mentioned already. But I also, with this, wanted to signpost the Passive House Benefits Report from 2001, co-written by John and Kate, who you'll hear from later. And I can't promise that Passive House will provide solutions to all these sort of like concerns we've got. Can't actually do anything about the building safety crisis or sort of like, you know, rent caps or the cost of living crisis particularly, but it can help in some way. And I think what's really helpful about the document is it provides the evidence and research to help make the case. And I was reading the new report from the housing regulator this morning around damp and mould in social housing and the lessons that we need to sort of like really learn. And it's a really good reminder how much that cold and damp is a huge problem even with the amount of investment that we've made over the years, and actually the real sort of like positive ground that actually has been gained. And if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you can sort of see how all the data of the English Housing Survey, how much has actually been achieved. However, if you look at the slide on the left-hand side, it shows that back in 1986, damp was most commonly experienced sort of like by older sort of like people. But today, this is the group which is actually least likely to live in damp homes. And nowadays, it's actually sort of like younger groups who are going to be there sort of like really struggling with it. And I've got three takeaways which are sort of like relevant for today and thinking about why Passive House should be part of the solution. And it may be that we've sorted out a lot of the low-hanging fruit with retrofit about dealing with damp, but we can't make assumptions that new builds are immune. I think where we've made the least improvement around condensation, damp and mould is where it's occupant related stuff, and I think Passive House and really thinking about that is absolutely key. And then we can't make sort of like these snap assumptions about who are the people who are suffering most from sort of like cold dampness and fuel poverty. I think we have to be really much more sort of like nuanced and subtle in terms of being able to target those who need the biggest help. And I'll leap over this sort of like slide really quickly because, the whole sector has been doing so much to try and sort of like tackle condensation, sort of like damp and mould. And, the whole issue is around homes which are overcrowded, where we've got higher humidity, all of those things we're very, very familiar with. But I just wanted to sort of like flag up the very last point on this slide. So Clarion's done a huge amount. We've mobilised additional sort of like trades operatives, surveyors. We've got this sort of like £5 million additional sort of like investment process. But I think the thing which is really critical is we've tried to embed this culture which is making this shift, that not seeing this as a problem as residents' behaviour. And I think that's one of the big, if you're making the argument for Passive House, it's this big sort of hurdle we need to overcome, that any problems aren't, it isn't just about sort of like residents and how they're using it. So I've already spent 3 slides on cold and damp. And I think that's important because it illustrates where the social and the technical factors come together. It's the people and building physics together, which is where I think we need to be sort of thinking really carefully about how the arguments work. We really need to be able to explain really clearly how Passive House reconciles air tightness, air movement, moisture and ventilation levels. Otherwise, it's not going to get the chance to demonstrate all of the potential benefits it can give if we don't understand that. Again, there's Passive Houses Trust have a really great guide published 2022 on air tightness, which is all about the technical details. So my sense is, a zero leakage building, it may be the technical possibility. We need to work harder perhaps about getting expected air changes, is what most commonly sort of like goes wrong. But what we really need to be doing is getting that consistency of delivery. And these are arguments I keep hearing time and time again. So what I did was try and think about how can we cut through those worries? How can we cut through that suspicion when we're talking to development colleagues? And I've borrowed a slide here from Jenny Brierley from Breathable Homes. And Jenny was a CEO at York Housing Association for many years before doing her PhD, which looked at recently built low carbon homes, which were designed to prevent heat loss through airtight construction. And I think she very much picked up this idea about the quality of ventilation in homes sits at that intersection of all these critical concerns. As homes become more airtight, that optimum ventilation for healthy indoor air and minimal heat loss, we need to get various factors right. We need expertly designed ventilation strategies. We need correctly specified systems. They've got to be accurately installed. They've got to be rigorously commissioned, and we all need that appropriate operation of the ventilation, both by the occupants and by management teams and maintenance staff. And Jenny spoke to residents about the homes, how they're managing technology, and maintenance staff in terms of their expectations and what they were sort of like really struggling with. And you know, what she found was quite often that housing associations were really underestimating the impact of ventilation on health, and you know, the lack of ventilation maintenance that was really creating that risk of unhealthy indoor air environments. And again, she sort of like really posed, so why are housing associations, you know, not as concerned about health risks of poor air as risks that we have from other sort of like safety or gas or fire sort of like hazards? And I think we now have all the drivers with AWAB's law and you know, things like the changes to the Decent Home Standard, which are now really posing hazards in this sort of like way of, you know, immediate risk to health or safety, that is beginning to sort of like pull this up the agenda, which I think is really important. The other reason I sort of flagged up Jenny's work is because it's landing really well with housing association colleagues here at sort of like Clarion, because I think it's all part of having that whole sort of like story. If Passive House can consistently deliver reduced damp and improved air quality, you know, that's a very positive benefit for our residents. But, you know, happy residents are more likely to pay the rent, and that's going to be a benefit to us as landlords. But when we always talk about Passive House, the first thing is always, you know, oh, let's reduce sort of like energy bills. And sometimes we can get really surprised when the opposite situation sort of like occurs. Passive Close is Clarion's one and only Passive House scheme from 2015. It's a development of 51 flats and terrace houses out in Rainham. We monitored it really closely for the first year, and we collected the usual kinds of data: indoor air temperature, air quality, CO2 levels. We struggled, as everybody always does, with getting accurate billing information, but we did in-depth interviews in spring, winter and summer seasons. And what was really cool about those was it was about getting the residents to actually demonstrate the control systems to show how they used them. And to be perfectly honest, the findings were really disappointing, particularly the complaints we received about overheating. And we were getting reports that it was uncomfortably warm all year round, there weren't the energy saving bills, and this thing about air quality could be sort of like stuffy. If only we'd read sort of, you know, Jenny's report in advance. We found, by investigating a bit further, it was partly design and commissioning of systems, but a lot of it was the sort of like the solar overheating, which was really exacerbated by omitting new trees, which would have provided seasonal shading. Some was down to sort of like occupants. There was quite a high use of appliances, some large plasma screens left on, or washing machines and tumble dryers. But the biggest confusion was about how to manage it, when and how to open sort of like windows. So in winter it felt too hot, and they were opening the windows, pushing up the heating, but in summer they weren't opening them to dump heat at night. And I guess what we really learned from there was we had underestimated how hard Passive House homes were for our customers to understand and to sort of like occupy. And I think that's too common a story, and we solved it by making a short introductory animation, and this seemed to work better than the massive handover information. And you know, now it's 8 years in, I think we've had one replacement. Sort of, you've had a bit of churn there, but not a lot of churn. You know, the video is the things that people really remember. And I think now we're only getting sort of like quite typical complaints about rubbish and parking. It's gradually getting better. But I think our lesson for the future scheme is that we really have to work harder with this. And, you know, we've had other health and benefits really reported back to us. And residents have really said that they've appreciated the new homes, even if they tended to mention the additional space rather than the energy efficiency aspects. But I think even with this mixed experience, looking forward, I think we are going to be able to sort of like align the benefits that Passive House can deliver to the outcomes that sort of like us as clients are looking for. And, you know, we all want simplicity, certainty, and quality. We want simple forms and standardized house types that we can repeat, that fit with our employers' our sort of like our ERs and our pattern books. We want to have robust, simple details, simpler heating systems, and streamlined ventilation strategies. We want cost certainty, predicted sort of like performance, and we are really, really looking for ways to see how we can justify the use of quality components and minimizing use failure and have that sort of like long life. So it feels as if there's, you know, there's real sort of like alignment there. However, to reap these benefits, we really need to counter some of these perceived problems and some of these sort of like real sort of like struggles, you know, and these misconceptions that I think we really want to sort of like need to reframe. And a lot about is thinking about this sort of changing the local requirements to saying, oh, we're just going to exceed building regs. And that's why it was really interesting to hear what Emma was sort of saying. And I guess also reiterating what Emma was saying about all the known sort of like problems with SAP and overestimation and inaccuracy. I think we need to be able to talk a lot more clearly about the way that the cost uplift and the benefit payback is often misunderstood, and it was mentioned sort of like just now. So while Exeter City sort of like is saying they can build Passive House without additional costs, I actually think, you know, and most people would accept maybe say a 5 to 10% uplift to get the benefits. I think actually few people really talk about how much added value is achieved and how much, you know, how much people are sort of like gaining from that and how we would really sort of like achieve that. And so, for example, Hasto did a really interesting exercise where they market tested their Wimbish scheme. You know, what would its market value be? And again, it was bringing in a higher value than the social element. And I think that's the sort of exercise that we need to sort of continue and to gather more data on. I'd also sort of like recommend to check out Hasto's excellent 10-year evaluation report on Wimbish. And that's picking up again some of the things about, you know, the costs and the maintenance costs of replacing, you know, replacing filters, and actually really thinking sort of like very carefully about what other added benefits you can get from having actually sort of like really good programs of looking after your assets. Don't just see it as a cost, see it as a value added that you can get out of it. I think we really have to sell the testing requirements as a benefit. You know, that's certifying airtightness, you know, is a guarantee of consistency. You know, it's also that final chance to find leaks and rectify mistakes on site before sort of like handover happens. And that's got to be so far cheaper in the long run than once you've got occupants in place. And I think we also can turn around that idea that there aren't enough skilled consultants and contractors. In Clarion's experience, there are lots of trained up architects and engineers who are really sort of like pushing this as an idea. I think it's more mainstream contractors supply chain which is lacking the experience and pricing the risks in. And I think clients and housing associations particularly asking for Passive House, it'll prompt increasing training and creating employment opportunities. And I'm going to flag up sort of like Richmond College, which is a scheme I'm going to talk about here with a sort of like a slide. Both partly very pleased that Emma mentioned sort of like Etude, but equally thinking of the four sort of like categories. Richmond College is 212 homes in Richmond. We got planning approval in August last year, and we've just sort of like started on site on it. London Borough of Richmond asked for net zero carbon compatible. They didn't ask for passive house. They didn't ask for you know, Emma's sort of like fourth category, which is what we are trying out on the largest block and one of the terraces. So for part of this sort of like scheme, we're trying to achieve net zero operational carbon on site, and we're designing that to sort of like the LETI standard. And you know, BPTW and Etude, who the architects and Etude have been working sort of like very closely with it. Etude, I think, really though, used the sort of like PHPP software to really work on the predicted heating demand and energy use. And that wasn't just because it was giving a more realistic estimate of heating energy demand and consumption and a much more dynamic simulation than sort of like SAP possibly could, but it allowed you to sort of very much sort of like play with the assumptions and to model areas of particular concern. And that was the sort of, you know, this was some of the bar charts, and there were lots of things that they were going through to really sort of like target in how they were going to do it. So that, using the passive house, and you can sort of see from the chart on the right hand side, actually sort of like setting yourself this target about where against the various sort of like passive, classic, plus or premium standards were we sort of like going to be setting it, was a really, really useful sort of like design stage exercise. And I think it very much develops the potential of the scheme. However, the proof, of course, is going to be in the, you know, the proof is in the pudding or the taste, or however, and actually measuring and working out whether we've got what we actually asked for. And Richmond College isn't being certified at the moment. And I think this is one of the most live debates we're having at the moment about taking this, well, how would you put it? I guess potentially passive house route. And the criticism is often that you're being seen to be wanting passive house, but without the cost of certification. My response to that is like, well, without the assessment process, do you know what you're going to get, what you ask for? And passive house is hard to achieve. And so it needs a real rigorous focus, both at the briefing and the design and the on-site stages. I think specifying passive house does send a really clear message to the design and the construction teams. It focuses tendering very much around energy and comfort. It sort of like keeps the user at the center, the occupant, the tenant, the resident at the center of that. And the added scrutiny of having an assessor, having a certifier, really will facilitate greater quality control. So I think there's this general growth that actually certification is more likely to give certainty of achieving, you know, the benefits you have. And I think this feels pretty persuasive arguments that us who are acting as sort of like clients within housing associations should be able to make with our development colleagues. And what I've actually flagged up on this side here is, I think the sector is going through, I think we all need to be sort of thinking a lot harder about really rigorous approaches to sort of like post-occupancy evaluation and building performance evaluation. And I flagged up here the new British standards, relatively new British standard, which I was involved with. The challenge here is this actually provides a really clear specification of the technical requirements for undertaking building performance evaluation. So we know what the mechanics of it, we know how we should do it, we know potentially what the benefits are. But in a very similar way to the arguments of following through and getting sort of passive house certification, what I'm finding is the biggest challenge is overcoming that operational resistance, you know, that sort of like, well, we could be doing it, or we'll do it in special cases, or we'll do it where there's something interesting, or we'll, you know, I think we've got a long way to go before, you know, real evaluation, real sort of like following through becomes business as usual. Final two slides. It sounds like I've talked a lot about negatives. I think a huge number of these will be addressed if we can get a step change in the numbers of passive house homes which are built. And I just think we just have to get out there and build. I've already mentioned the growing number of design professionals and contractors who are I think professionals are really getting their heads around it, and we are beginning to see more and more contractors, and that's got to be absolutely brilliant. The scale of passive house developments, I think, are really increasing. So Goldsmith Street was 100 homes. Agar Grove is 500 homes. You know, Hasto's 12 schemes, they may all be relatively sort of small, but they all come together as a big number. I think we're starting to move away from having a few leading housing associations with, you know, 1 or 2 exemplar schemes to more people trying. And I think we've got to be really positive, see that as positive. I think there's something really heartening with the number of community-led housing associations who are considering passive house for their pipeline. And I think, again, that's another indication of you know, understanding the benefits for your occupants. And listening to Emma, it is so good to hear the enthusiasm across sort of like councils across the country. And for a national organisation like Clarion, the more that we get to sort of like work with lots of other housing, other local authorities, so Exeter and Plymouth and Essex and Cambridge, you know, I think the importance that I'll get. Okay, very, very last bit. So we need to scale up. But we need to scale up really, really quickly. We can't forget the existing homes. I think the obvious lessons to maximise potential benefit are get in early, you know, use the design methodology, following it through, target energy use first, but don't be prescriptive, set challenging but achievable standards. And I think there's a bit of work to be done to be calling to integrate these into the regulation better. I'm really excited that from December 2024, new housing in Scotland has to be built to the Scottish House passive equivalent. Right now, nobody knows quite what that means, but I think the ambition is sort of like spot on. I think the honest sort of like situation is we're not always going to get it 100% right. However, one of the responsibilities of being an enlightened client is being open and talking about what didn't work just as much as what did work. And so we know what to do differently next time. So I think as well as making the benefits case and arguing for that, we also have to understand the risks and how to mitigate them. So thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for an incredibly thorough explanation of all of the work that you're in, as well as your professional views. Quite enjoyed your description of being an enlightened client and the risk and the responsibility, I suppose, that comes with that. What I'm going to do is going to move on to Kate so that we can have enough time to come back at the end. Just to note that somebody did say that they appreciated your honesty in the chat about the fact that it wasn't all roses the first time round. A lot of lessons have been learned about that since. There's also been lots of information shared in the Q&A about how the process has evolved and how things are, you know, our capability of measuring and understanding has changed and improved, and will continue to do so if we can all be as open and collaborative in the same way that you have expressed. So thank you for that. There are loads of questions for you, but we're going to try and get to as many of those in the whole table Q&A. So now I'm going to introduce Kate de Selincourt. Kate, if you want to take over, and if you can use 10 minutes so that we can get through some of those questions, because I think lots of people are very keen to ask some questions. It just never seems to be quite enough time. We're doing the best we can, people. There's just an awful lot of knowledge to be shared. So over to you, Kate.
Okay, hi. Nice that so many people are here. But bear with me just one moment. I'm not in my usual office. So if my tech doesn't work, my clicker doesn't work, then I'll get there, I'm sure. So I'm going to try and share my slides now, and let's see if it actually works. Okay.
We've had all sorts of tech interruptions, so don't worry, Kate, I'm sure we'll get there.
Okay, so let's try this. Got no idea if that's any good.
Fantastic. We can see the advantages of Passive House. Is that where you were starting?
Fabulous. That's even the first slide, even better.
Oh, well, excellent. Good luck.
Okay, so I'm going to whiz through some of this because I wasn't quite sure what would be covered previously. So I kind of covered all the ground, and some of it I don't need to repeat, I think. But that's just my kind of summary. that what Passive House brings generally is a proven, low energy, comfortable building, including a dwelling, obviously, with good IAQ, tends well, it stops mold before it starts, really. There's no recorded mold in the academic analysis of Passive House, certainly. And of course, it gives progress towards climate goals. And now that clicker doesn't work, so I'll try this one. And that's not working either. Oh my good Lord. This is slightly awkward.
I can see your mouse on screen, so it might be that if you just click, however you can, there you go.
Yes, I didn't click hard enough. I'm so sorry. Right, okay, so what are we up against? I mean, I think this is familiar ground for everyone, but this last winter, obviously, was absolutely brutal. Sorry about that missing picture. We had an energy price crisis, and although prices have fallen back a bit from the highs of last winter for consumers anyway, we're not expecting it to go back to how it was. And it wasn't just people on very low incomes who were suffering as a result of this, it was everybody really. And quite a lot of people were not using their heating at all, which is a huge issue, not only obviously for occupants of buildings, but also for the owners of the buildings, for the buildings themselves, because cold buildings are damp buildings. Now, have I got what's going on here? Yes, so cold. This was Switch's data showing that this is over a series of years, showing that homes under 18, which is the World Health Organization safety temperature, has gone up to about 20% in the coldest weather in this sort of large cohort of social dwellings. It was
Kate, you're no longer sharing slides, is that?
I'm no longer sharing. What has happened? I am so sorry. I'll try again.
That's all right. Would you like us to try and share from our side of things? Would that help?
Sure, I'll try this again.
Okay.
Has it come back?
Yes, it has. Yes, it has.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I can only look at one of the screens at once, and my display is split across two screens. I do apologise.
No, that's fine. I'll keep an eye. Don't worry.
Okay, let's try this again then. Okay, so this is showing how many more people were living in dangerously cold homes, and that was killing them. A lot of people died last winter, and a lot of respiratory deaths, which are quite likely to be associated with cold, underventilated homes, as well as obviously the infections that they work together, basically germs and terrible conditions. And cold homes are damp homes, and we've got some data here showing that the longer you have your heating on, the more likely you are to be in that pale green, as in low risk of mold, lower humidity. If you have your heating on for 2 or 3 hours less per day, as people were, then the risk goes right up. And we all know what a damp home can do. And it's not only does it kill people, obviously, from the landlord's point of view, it's a nightmare too. So Passive House tackles this, and I think I'll just scoot through this to show just a couple of slides in here about this is what happens in a passive house, and that's the orange line versus this is a standard new build as was designed and constructed in the last few years, but including the performance gap that is typically seen in UK construction. And what we've got here is a January day, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, but obviously even a passive house requires a bit of heating. And when the heating is turned off because people have got no money and they just cannot afford to put it on, then the passive house will cool down, but it will maintain an unpleasant but not kind of fatal temperature, compared to a non-passive house dwelling, which just loses heat far more quickly through the leaks because it hasn't necessarily got heat recovery ventilation, and because it's got poorer components, thermal bridges and the rest of it. So this has been tested in real life. These are people who actually turned off their heating to see what would happen, and actually the houses did better than the one in the graph above, and they stayed warm. And this means that people are not, there's one whole worry off their plates, one less thing to spend money on. They're often, if it's densely occupied, maybe warm enough without any heating at all. And people describe this as life-changing, and they appreciate the good ventilation in Passive House, and their health improves. As Eleanor said, she's had reports from her passive homes, and these are other people in other projects, particularly respiratory issues, which are linked to both low temperatures and poor air quality. And this one here, oops, I'm going the wrong way now. I don't know if I can get back. The issue of laundry. People can dry their laundry in a passive house, and instead of it filling the rooms with damp and then it all condensing on the walls are warm and the air is exchanged. So the damp is purged away through the MVHR, and you don't get mold, and then the landlord and the occupant are happy. Now I showed this, I put this picture on here because they're very quiet passive houses, which might seem like a trivial luxury kind of thing, but Emma Osmondson in Exeter had an interesting experience, which is, if you'll forgive the reference to Glastonbury, that they got less antisocial behaviour because people weren't bothered by the noise their neighbours were making. So that's something to think about too. The overheating issue, I think we're getting a lot better at designing passive house so that it can stay cool, and it's certainly thought about from the very outset with a passive house design, unlike with a lot of other designs. And I think although we've now got Part O, we don't yet know whether that's a help or a hindrance. Okay, so the thing with passive house, as Eleanor was saying, is the rigorous design and the rigorous checks on construction and commissioning by the certifier. So it means you've got high aspirations and you actually meet them, as opposed to standard UK construction, where we, as I mentioned earlier, and there's lots of information on the Passive House Trust about this, the performance gap, whereby a combination of SAP not working very well, so the energy demand is going to be higher than SAP's told people it will be, and then it's actually not built properly, so the energy use goes up again. Things are built like this with missing ventilation and missing insulation, but also you've got the undersized ventilation fans that go in non-passive house because no one's checking, underpowered, got extra long ducts that slow the air down, and so again you're not getting that air exchange, so people's moisture is staying in the building and then it's condensing on the thermal bridges that nobody designed out. So and this is how people use non-MVHR ventilation. Most of the occupants are in the groups on the left, and that means that they've got less than half their ventilators open, the trickle vents in the windows, and it's noisy fans people turn off, and this is what happens as a consequence, as we know. So I suppose the argument really is that passive house meets landlords' needs in so many ways. It's good for the reputation, it's good for the occupants, and the happy occupants means that there's less complaints and disrepair claims. And passive house is built to last. The quality components that are required for certification are carefully designed, carefully manufactured, and therefore less likely to fall to bits. That's the experience of people who've now owned passive houses for 10 years or so. I'm sorry, I'm having to gallop through this a bit, but just a little note about ESG reporting. There's a wide range of goals, which if you look at the Passivhaus Trust benefits reports that I am slowly completing and slowly being posted up on the Passivhaus Trust website, you can see that it's more than just health and freedom from energy poverty. It's things like the peace and quiet and the lack of antisocial behaviour, meaning people can sleep, meaning children have somewhere warm to do their homework. And these are all things that are counted in these various metrics. I'm so sorry about this. I don't know if I can make it go back to the previous slide. No, I can't. What I was going to talk
some
about
arrows on your keyboard, Kate.
What's that?
Have you got arrows on your keyboard? You could try the back arrow. I don't want to mess with you.
Good Lord, I'm so sorry about this. Let's see. No. Oh, yes. Now it's just jumped to.
There you go.
Okay, so yes, I was going to talk about green lending, which, you know, as a first thing, the people like Lloyds and Scottish Widows, they are looking for good, safe and sound in a ethical sense and in a climate sense, where places to put their customers' money, and pension funds in particular want something that's going to last and is, you know, doing good on the long term and is secure. So low energy housing kind of meets those criteria. So they're keen to lend into housing and including social housing, but they do need to have some kind of measurable outcomes, in particular climate outcomes. And again, the advantage of a certified passive house is that you can monitor it, and past experience with Passivhaus does show that the performance gap is on average 0 in the UK, unlike uncertified non-passive house buildings. And so this means that your lender is happy and hopefully will lend you some more, and then you can build some more. So this is quite an interesting kind of aspect that distinguishes Passivhaus from a kind of aspirational net zero building. And last of all, really, to say that yes, Passivhaus may cost more money, in particular to begin with, more effort on the part of whoever's building it, who's commissioning it and who's designing it and who's building it. But to meet all these issues that we've got, our climate targets, fuel poverty issues, damp and mould, money and effort are going to have to be spent. So I suppose the argument would be that you might as well spend that money and effort on getting something that you know is actually going to work. So I'll leave you looking at a picture of, if I can get my mouse in the right place, the 2 reports so far available on the Passivhaus Trust, the benefits one, which goes across all the ground that's being covered today, and then the health wellbeing report, which is a very detailed dive into the various ways in which poor housing affects people's health and well-being, and that Passivhaus hopefully tackles those issues. So hopefully we can share those in your party bag. So,
thank you so much, Kate. You did really well considering you were having all sorts of tech issues. So well done.
I'm very sorry about all that.
No, not at all, not at all. If you want to, dare I say, unshare, and then we'll welcome Eleanor and Emma back for a general conversation. I do think I just want to make one statement, which is, I dare say everybody in this room has been in conversations where people are saying, oh yeah, it does cost a little bit more, it costs a little bit more, it takes a little bit more effort. Okay, it does. It does. We're not going to argue that away, but it's becoming less costly. It's becoming less effort, and that's just the direction to travel. We've just got to go both feet in with confidence, and that's what we want to try and do. That's what the trust exists to do. It's what all these expert speakers are here to support with. So I think we do just have to like make those commitments and then pull on all of the available resources to make that case, which is the purpose of being here today.
Can I sneakily share another slide if I can find it quickly?
You can, you've got the controls, you can drive, Kate.
Okay. So here it is.
Do share it.
And now let's see if I can get my mouse on the screen.
You can't say here it is and leave us all hanging like that now.
Here you go. This is Nick Grant's slide showing that if you get in early, then you can get the cost right from the beginning. And if you want to change it to make it more like a passive house, it's not going to cost you much. But if you don't think about passive house until 3/4 of the way through, it's going to be really hard. You've not got much influence, and it's going to cost you a fortune. So
that's a great point to make. And actually, if anybody wants to revisit the event that we held in January, in fact, to mention them again, Etude and Levitt Bernstein. Yes, this is really important. This is exactly what that is. It's true for any change curve. This is what that can look like. So yeah, I think that's right. And I think Claire Murray and Thomas Lefebvre made the point really well about that early stage, baking in your intentions from the get-go. Changing anything as you proceed is always going to be clunky. We know, we've all been involved in unpicking those things. So I think it's right to remember that. It's like setting that intention at the beginning and surrounding yourself with the skills and knowledge that you can. So we've got loads of questions, but I suspect that we could probably have a bit of a conversation anyway. And Eleanor, your hand's gone up. Go ahead.
It was just following up on that as well. I think both councils and housing associations as repeat clients, we should be able to cover some of those first original sort of like startup costs for early schemes. And I think that's, you know, maybe I didn't emphasize that enough in what I was saying. One of the things about scaling up and doing several of these is that they will become sort of like cheaper and easier sort of like in time. And I think was it Exeter who was sort of really talking about actually it's you know, they're already sort of like seeing reductions in their, you know, the further you get through a program of work. And a lot of that, I think, is about the way that organisations do work to internalise that sort of like learning. And I think it's true with sort of like any sort of technology, any sort of like change in innovation. You know, you watch it, but you have to make it and own it yourself to really get the efficiencies and the values out of it, really.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. What I might try and do is like weave back through some of the questions that our really engaged audience have been asking. And this one, I caught my eye whilst you were speaking, Eleanor, so we'll just read out. It's from Edward, and it says, have Clarion adapted their net present value model for new homes to wrap up all the costs and benefits of passive house? For example, damp and mold, better golden thread, fewer defects, increased tenancy sustainability, and has this taken account of BIM being a legal requirement from October 2022? Huge question, lots of really interesting things in there. Sorry now, Eleanor, to just dump you straight in there, but I think it's a great question.
And touches on my favourite subject, which is why do we measure whole life cost, not whole life value? The way our net present value model, well, it's different than the overall big models, but there is this constant sort of like set of adjustments about depending on what we're learning and how, and it's everything from sort of like what we're learning with the building safety retrofits to sort of, you know, the information that we learn from our sort of like assets. And I think it's fair to admit, although BIM with new build and the way that the modelling is improving really well there. That's coming on one side. I think a lot of the asset management using BIM and modelling around that is where we're actually harvesting some of the really, really useful sort of information. And I think where we're going to get the huge sort of like changes is when we can sort of like mesh those two sort of like together, where we can actually really do that whole sort of like cradle to grave sort of like assessment. And it feels like we're at a very exciting time with this. You know, we're finally beginning to see, you know, Edward's hit a really good question. We're finally beginning to start to see that data being useful rather than just being something that's being gathered and sitting sort of like on, you know, in some data warehouse somewhere.
I mean, I think this is probably what's Kate, do you want to just talk a little bit about the papers that you shared on your last slide? Because I think in terms of quantifying and measuring and having evidence, you know, that's a lot of the work that you've been doing a lot of in-depth analysis of. So do you want to just like talk a little bit more about what people might expect to find in that?
Yes, the Passivhaus benefits, the sort of summary has got some figures in about things like the performance gap, which is obviously a very important one, and looking more widely at how Passivhaus meshes in with zero carbon, although there's ever such a lot that's also on the Passivhaus Trust website that's not in that report. But also with the health and well-being and the sort of, and subjects like when disabled people need to be warm, then how much more does it cost them? Little sort of finer grain things like that. There's quite a lot looking at those either in the health paper or the social benefits paper, which I'm still working on. But the sorry, I've lost the thread of what the beginning of the question was now.
Well, I mean, it was just about that. It was just explaining a little bit more about what people can expect to. And the background for me asking you that question was really that point around, we talk about whole life costs a lot. We do, that's true. And actually, we're answering those questions by pulling out these sort of broader benefits, but actually framing it as whole life value, which I think is probably it's the transitional conversation, isn't it? It's moving away from like, does this cost you more, to what additional benefit and value are you getting? And sort of framing it in that much more like, do you want to still aspire to the thing that was costing you less and be convinced? And
well, it's not costing you less, that's the thing. I mean,
there you go.
I haven't analysed the actual costs of owning a cheap building, but they're very high.
Yeah.
And I think some of the costs of owning a cheap building are actually hidden by court orders. That a lot of the court cases where people have had to go to court because their building's been built so crappily, it's settled out of court because the legal costs are so high, and of course that suits the contractor and the designer, and it's the only thing that the aggrieved party can really afford, and so they get their building rebuilt, but we don't get to hear about exactly what a disaster it was for everyone involved. And that's before you look at the impact on the reputation of the client. Unfortunately, you know, we remember whose buildings they were, at least people who lived in them certainly do. So, you know, somebody puts in a bad ventilation system into your dwellings, then you're the one who's going to get on social media with you know, people pointing to the black splodges on their wall, and not the person who failed to put in a decent ventilation system.
It is, I think, more about that framing of the whole life value and the difference between what you're getting, instead of it being, you know, it's a whole other way of framing and looking at that. Emma, just to bring you back in, hopefully your internet is with us. Are you seeing that there was a question? I mean, there were some specific questions about what you were talking about earlier on, such as like the energy balance metric and actually some of the numbers that you threw up there. But given the kind of context of just seeing what's better, are you seeing a shift in the appetite? I think you sort of suggested that you were in an appetite for planning departments and for local plans as well, for just needing to see better and understanding what potential impact using those levers for better standards and metrics are?
I think there's a huge amount of interest from local planning authorities in how can we do better? How can we, you know, I've spoken at various webinars and things recently, and there's a huge number of local planning authorities out there just wanting to know how do we do this ourselves. Now, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need to do this because building regs would just be better. You know, let's take the Scottish example where they are now looking to mandate effectively passive house. If that was what we had in England, we wouldn't need to have local planning authorities setting their own standards. I mean, in fairness, most of us are looking at very similar metrics. But yeah, I think there's a huge appetite out there. I've been approached by so many different local authorities wanting to know, right, how have you done this? What's your evidence base? How do we do something similar? And I think it is all linked into the fact that, you know, we're in a climate emergency. Most of us have declared climate emergencies, and we need to be doing better. Ultimately, if something goes wrong with a home, residents will come to local authorities to complain. So there's also, you know, there's that whole thing about the impact on the public purse when things go wrong, you know, the impact on the NHS when things go wrong, the impact on local authorities. You know, we've seen it where we've had schemes going, you know, something's not been constructed in accordance with plans, they will come back to us. And then there's a huge resource implications for local authorities trying to rectify those problems. So yeah, I think it all links into this whole idea of quality new development, and how, you know, this is an integral part for me in delivering, dare I even use the word beautiful, which I know has been bandied around quite a lot, but it's an integral part of high quality design. You can't separate these things out. So I'm very strongly of the view that there's a role for local planning authorities in this, until the point in time when building regulations does become more ambitious, and who knows what will happen there.
I think this is a natural sort of segue then into maybe what we might discuss just for the last couple of minutes before we close up on resilience. I think resilience is probably the most important framing of doing better with standards at the moment, because obviously, as we've all been through, and who can forget last summer with 42 degrees, you know, there's a need for our buildings to be able to withstand much greater extremes in the environmental conditions that we're seeing, as well as goodness knows what's coming in terms of energy price crisis and that sort of economic conditions as well. And resilience, therefore, not only a new build, because it's sort of stepping back out a little bit, isn't it? Because we're talking about resilience and we're talking about the ability of our buildings to perform so that they don't need the attention. There was a question earlier on about retrofit, so that they don't need more resources and materials and energy for retrofitting. So we want to get our new builds to a point where they can sort of look after themselves into the future, whilst we turn our attention to the very real and concerning questions around retrofit. And making those buildings resilient, because if we do, we know that what we're doing is protecting all those benefits that you talked about as well, Kate, about the resilience, about the ability for people to be okay in their homes. And it was that point that you made, Emma, about, you know, the climate crisis, the energy price crisis, all these interconnected crises are experienced in the home primarily. And so I think this resilience bit is so important. To the floor, if anybody feels they want to come in on that question of resilience and just talk a little bit to that. Kate, you
well, a couple of points I can make about that. One of them is extreme cold and power outages. I discovered at the International Passivhaus Conference that in Canada, if your home drops below 16 degrees, you're evicted. I mean, not evicted, you're evacuated, because it's considered dangerous. Right. And it's interest. And there was a big Enefit project in a Canadian city where they didn't have to evacuate people in a power outage because their homes didn't get too cold. So that was a big saving to the local authority. In a heat wave, Passivhaus is designed to restrict overheating. I mean, if it's hot at night and hotter during the day, you know, you can't physically get the temperature down low. And I think people are getting a lot better at shutting out the sun and generally controlling the temperature. But I think we need to face the fact that in inner city locations, especially for vulnerable people, that we are confronting the need to install cooling in some places. And even if we don't install it as building owners, then people are buying it. The thing with passive houses, it's got quite a lot of aspects which enable you to minimise the amount of energy you need to cool it. The heat recovery ventilation can actually also act as cool recovery ventilation. So the cool that you're putting in with your little air conditioning unit is conserved. So you don't have to keep running it, you know, and you'll keep your dwelling cool. So, and there are actual calculations for the cooling load. So that's another aspect of the resilience there.
Just anecdotally, I think this is always useful when you have like lived experience examples for people. Last year, when we had the heat wave where it did get up to 42 degrees in London, I was contacted by Sky News to say, where should we go to see what buildings are managing in this heat wave, you know? And the conversation was, well, you need to go to homes. And we would have, you know, straight off the bat considered something like Agar Grove and whatever, but they had been through quite a lot of, can we come and look at your house, please? So it was time to leave those residents alone for a little while. The next best thing that I could consider, that I knew I could gain access to under the time pressures of media, was Greenleaf Road, which was the Waltham Forest low energy retrofit. Now, it wasn't to an NFIT standard as such. What they were trying to do was do something as quickly as they possibly could within a given sort of budget and time frame. There's more information you can read about that now. And on top of that, they were trying to get a family housed. It was one of their homes. So I managed to get all the people together to get up to Greenleaf Road. And I was really concerned about getting up there because I didn't fancy cycling in 42-degree heat. I had a bit of a concern about pulling out a taxi driver to be driving around in that heat, given the fact that the roads were melting. But in the end, I did go in a taxi. His dash thermometer said 42 degrees. We got up to Greenleaf Road. It hadn't been occupied for a while. It had no furniture in it and no curtains, and it wasn't being actively managed. And internally was 27 degrees. Can you imagine if it had have had curtains and if it had been actually actively managed, and people were, you know, purging at night and actively managing the solar gain in the day? And that's not even at NFIT standard. And it was, you know, incredible to be able to be in that property and there be a 15-degree difference between inside and out. And that, you know, was just through whatever they could achieve within the limited budget they have. To just, you know, just cast that forward and you can see the potential that you have for that. Now, happily, there's a family in there experiencing the benefits of that. So any final comments from anybody before I just share a couple of little bits of news and information? Anything anybody feels they just didn't get a chance to say? No? Well, no, a huge thank you to you speakers for sharing so much. And again, you know, I thought we'd have loads of time to get through all the questions. We still have lots unanswered, but I hope that everybody listening has gotten a lot from today's session. As we said at the beginning, we will share lots of information in the party bag, which is the email you'll receive through where you signed up to attend today. I wonder, Lynn, if you're in the background, could you share just the last couple of slides? Thank you so much. Here we have some of the things, some of the links. These were probably all shared throughout in the chat, but you will get these directly in your party bag. So a couple of bits on retrofit, social housing and passive house and planning in there. If you could move to the next slide, please. Yes, so again, there's some more information there. For anybody here who is a really new beginner, we've got the introduction, we've got how to build passive house. There was some great information on that. And as Kate shared already, the passive house benefits guide. And last but not least, I think, yes, so you can tune in to the 2023 UK Passive House Awards, which are happening pretty soon. I know I should know because I'm going, but follow that link.
Next week.
Next week. Thank you, John. next week. We also have the Cost of Passive House, our event coming up in September. So, you know, get as soon as you can, sign up to that one. That will be pulling apart of all the sticky issues around costs for Passive House. And then, of course, we've got the fantastic Passive House conference, and that will be in Edinburgh this year and online. So take a look at all of those things. Really thankful for all of you giving up your time to listen to us today, and we really hope that you've enjoyed it. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.